before we get started. We have two lovely guest speakers today, Michelle Papania and her mother, Gigi. And what's interesting, a couple of really interesting notes. Not quite a year ago, I didn't check the date, but shortly after all this started, Michelle did a session for us on things that we need to make sure we stay focused on to keep ourselves mentally and physically and emotionally healthy as we move through that. Who knew at that point in time that a year later we would still be thinking about those things? And so Michelle is going to join us today to give an update on that. And I am going to say that Michelle is one of the, there's probably several, but I specifically remember that Michelle has been a part of the COCE family right from the time she joined the FAU faculty, and that's been really, really cool. So I am going to turn it over to Michelle and Gigi. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone is doing well today. So today I just want to, follow up with some things that, as Dr. Judy said, that we discussed last year. Okay, so this is the title of this presentation is Self-Care and Stress Management, Importance and Strategies. So I have to confess, I stole this off Twitter and I couldn't help myself. When we talked about self-care, don't forget to practice self-care as you're, barely keeping your head above water, right? Like it's just so easy to practice self-care. And yet, as difficult as it is, I think it's something that's really important to do. So what is our new reality? So we know that, again, COVID-19 has turned our lives upside down, not only how we work, but how we interact with one another. And I've heard from many people, that a year into this, they're not coping any better now than they were back then. This is a reality that was thrust upon us. It wasn't our choice. We've never had to cope with anything like this before. The last pandemic was 100 years ago. And so this is a completely new experience for us. And, people are after a year, they're wondering, if they can keep, how much longer they can sort of keep working through these issues. So what are the issues? Certainly working in less than ideal environments. And if anybody has a funny story about anything, we've probably seen some of the funny videos on social media about things that have happened. Pets seem to be a common theme, kids. I was in a faculty meeting on Friday, and one of our faculty members had to keep, turning his video off because his toddler was just, it was, you got your hands full with that. So, working in less than ideal environments, especially when we're distracted, lots of people like working at home. I actually enjoy working at home, but we certainly have more distractions when we're at home. Family members, pets, again, children, all of those things that can distract us. Certainly lack of normalcy and routine. Many of my students have had a real difficult time, when they know they have to be at a certain classroom at a certain time, that seems to drive their schedule. But when they can just view the video of a lecture at their convenience, at their leisure, it's really hard to keep that routine in place. And it's really the same for everybody, not just our students, but for all of us. Sadly, many of us have probably experienced personal or familial health issues, personal and familial financial issues, and then just the stress of the whole situation. And with stress often comes panic, social isolation. I can count on less than one hand the number of people I've had physical contact with in the last year, and that's tough, right? It's really tough, and loneliness. But probably one of the bigger ones is worry, and worry is sort of born out of the fear of the unknown. What is going to be? Most of us like, our predictable existence. And when we don't know what's coming down the road, that can cause a lot of worry for us. Any other issues that any of you have been experiencing that I haven't touched on?
Yeah, it's interesting what your comment about how many people you've actually interacted with. I never thought about the counting, but it's an interesting perspective, way of thinking about it.
And thank God for technology like Zoom. So I can Zoom with my family members who live in Idaho and in Tennessee and in Connecticut, and I can do it all at the same time, which is awesome. So there's a little bit of a silver lining. We've all been forced to adapt to technology, but in a way, we can actually still see one another and still interact with one another. So I've actually had more interaction with my sister in Idaho since the pandemic, because we Zoom regularly than we did before. And so again, one of the silver linings there. But just to quickly sort of, I know being in the exercise science and health promotion department, I always like to talk about the stress response, how we respond to stress. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I tend to go into too much and then we don't have enough time for discussion. But stress is any condition, whether it's physical or emotional, that threatens our homeostasis, right? So what is homeostasis? So derived from the Greek words for same and steady, it's simply the collectively and ongoing processes that living organisms use to maintain stable internal conditions that are necessary for our survival. The stress response provides us with the resources necessary to cope with the stressor, whether it's a physical stressor or an emotional stressor, and whether that stress is good or bad, right? So the body doesn't distinguish between good stress, also called eustress, and bad stress, which is called distress. Stress is stress, and whether it's a good stress or a bad stress, the body tends to respond exactly the same.
And Michelle, we're commenting about the fact that there is a need for some good stress in our lives.
Well, and why is that? So does anybody want to talk about, how stress can benefit us?
I would say it could be a bit of a motivator.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're going to see, what happens in short term. But in terms of how the body responds to stress, Hans Selye developed the general adaptation syndrome. And he talks about, our normal condition of homeostasis. And then the phases of stress, the alarm stage, the resistance stage, and then ultimately the exhaustion stage if stress persists. So I have the acute or the alarm phase in green for good, which sort of sounds counterintuitive. You're saying, geez, the alarm phase, how can the alarm phase be good? Well, because in the alarm phase, what happens is we get shot of adrenaline, also known as epinephrine. That's a stress hormone that gets released into our body. We get some cortisol too, but it's epinephrine that dominates. And what epinephrine does as part of our fight or flight response is it readies the body to cope with that emergency, to cope with the short-term changes in our environment. So it breaks down substrate fuels, to give us energy. It makes us more alert. We're more aware of our surroundings. We can problem solve very quickly. Right, so it's basically our survival mechanism, but we can use this to our advantage. So I always say that the acute or alarm phase of stress is always good. And it's always good because it's giving our body what it needs in order to cope with the stressor, what's challenging us at the moment. And so the acute response to stress is always a good thing. The problem with stress is when it becomes chronic. That's when we start to, both when we begin in the resistance phase and then ultimately in the exhaustion phase. That's when the body starts to lose the ability to cope with stress, and our body can actually start to break down. So the resistance phase occurs when stress persists for greater than a few hours. And, and for some people, that's days, weeks, months, even years of chronic persistent stress. And then during this whole time, there's a continued release of stress hormones. But instead of adrenaline or epinephrine, which is our sort of our acute stress hormone, we get cortisol, which is more of a chronic stress hormone that dominates. And cortisol, chronically elevated cortisol levels are associated with a whole host of problems. Insulin resistance, metabolic disease, bone breakdown, the breakdown or the dampening of the immune system. So loss of skeletal muscle, breakdown of skeletal muscle. So all kinds of bad things start to happen to the body when cortisol dominates for an extended period of time. And then if the stress persists and we reach the exhaustion phase, now we've gotten to the point where there's a complete breakdown of the body's ability to maintain homeostasis, right? So a breakdown of homeostatic regulation. And that's because our resources are now depleted and we are unable to cope. At this phase, disease is inevitable and death is possible, right? Unless we turn that situation around. So we go from sort of squeezing the little stress ball in the acute phase to our chronic phase when, we've got all of these things swirling around us and it lasts for, it persists for an extended period of time up to the point where then the fuel tank becomes empty. So let's just go ahead.
Michelle, question for you. I don't think I have ever heard anybody say that stress could be a potential cause of death. That's an eye-opener.
And it's not the stress itself per se that's the cause of death, but it's the body's, once we get to the exhaustion phase and our physical resources have been depleted, the body is simply unable to cope with the continuing stress and disease, right? The body begins to break down and suffer. And if those disruptions in homeostasis are severe enough or long lasting enough, that can cause us to die. If you have heart disease, you could have a heart attack. Vascular disease, you can develop diabetes, which if left unmanaged can. So yes, absolutely. Now, this isn't something that just happens, but certainly with a dampened immune response, you're very susceptible to diseases that, can be life-threatening. So there's all kinds of really bad things that happen to us when we allow ourselves to get to the exhaustion phase.
Thank you.
So Gigi wanted to mention something about, the long-term effects of stress.
Right, on mental health. I think most suicides, the underlying issue is untreated stress, people that don't know how to deal with their stress. Interestingly, from Thanksgiving through New Year, I think many people experience lots of positive stress, lots of negative stress. And come the first week in January, my phone rings off the hook with people who are in the exhaustion stage from either positive or negative, or more likely the combination of the two, spread out over a 6-week period.
Yep. Yeah, and when she says her phone rings off the hook, she's a licensed clinical social worker, and so she sees patients in a clinical setting.
Depression being the most common presenting problem in January.
Yeah.
The letdown, what I call the letdown phase, the letdown from the high of the holidays.
And so presumably it was more so this year because of, I mean, I would imagine that typically January sees some of that, but I would assume more so this year because of everything being different.
Right, exactly. Although, frankly, talk about silver linings. There are probably lots of families that weren't having food fights over the dining room table. So again, there was probably a lot more calm and peace and perhaps appreciation of what the holidays really mean, because we have been a little bit more isolated or Zooming instead of sitting next to one another, sadly.
Yeah, and I personally see gratitude as one of the silver linings.
Yeah, and when we're going to talk about one of the coping mechanisms or self-care strategies, I always like to talk about is having an attitude of gratitude.
Which, Dr. Judy, I believe, at least for me, gratitude is the foundation of my entire life. And every one of us can find something to be grateful for.
Absolutely. Yep. I'm with you 100%, Gigi.
Yep. So just a little bit more about the stress response. Stress obviously affects cognitive function, which includes learning. The effects of stress on cognition depend on the intensity of the stress, the duration of the stress, again, whether it's acute or chronic versus chronic, and the source of the stress, whether it's intrinsic, meaning task-specific stress, or whether it's extrinsic, meaning that there are stressors outside the task, for example, our current circumstances. So we always have task-specific stress, especially, or I should say usually regarding work. We all tend to have some work-related task-specific stress, but then that's exacerbated or made worse by outside, stressors outside the task, like the circumstances that surround us with COVID-19. Interestingly, mild stress actually helps implicit memory as well as simple declarative tasks. And again, that's part of the fight or flight response, right? That acute response that gives us what we need to meet the challenge of the situation. But when we are exposed to chronic or high or very extreme levels of stress, explicit memory formation tanks, as does complex and flexible reasoning. And what's the huge problem with that? Well, when we can't reason, when we lose our ability to flexibly reason, we can't problem solve, right? We don't see the solutions to the problems that are in front of us. And that's when we panic. And that's when we become depressed. And how many of us, and I raise my hand, have had difficulty remembering things, and just trying to think through it, thinking through and remembering just seems a little bit more difficult these past few months. And a lot of that has to do with the additional stress we've all been under. All right, so this is Gigi's area of expertise. So I'm gonna let her take over here. Any questions on the stress response before we talk about worry? Okay.
Too many of us tend to worry. I think a lot of time people will say, I'm worried, when really they're not, they're concerned. Concern is the best place to be. Looking at my own family history, I had a brother who lived in apathy. He wasn't concerned about anything. And consequently, sadly, his life wasn't very enjoyable or successful by society's measure. I fortunately learned how to live in the concern box. And I say I learned it because I was a worry wart for many years. My younger sister was always in the worry box. And what is worry? Worry is nothing more than fear. Fear of the unknown. Worry always lives in the future. It's never in the past. We're always worrying about something that may happen or could happen, or we're not going to get something we want. How do you know the difference between worry and concern? Well, first off, worry can cause lots of distress. It's that feeling of powerlessness that can consume you. It can result in stomach distress, headaches, tension, fatigue, sleep disturbance, appetite disturbance, either not wanting to eat or overeating. And again, it's fear. And if you think about it, worry solves absolutely nothing. Concern, on the other hand, always lives in the present. And concern motivates us to identify what may or may not be the problem and to problem solve, to look for solutions. Worry, on the other hand, can shut down our creative thinking to where we're literally immobilized and can't come up with solutions. One of the things that I learned early on was, how do I know when I'm in the worry zone? Well, again, it doesn't feel good. So how do I get myself back into the concern middle of the road? And what I used was a simple elastic band around my wrist. And when I found that I was up in the worry zone, I would snap that band. And that little bit of pain will always bring you back to the here and now. And here's what's interesting about worry. It is a learned behavior. Nobody is born worrying. If you watch a toddler, they worry about nothing. They are too involved with what's going on right now. So as educators, I'm sure you all, hopefully you'll all agree, that what we learn, we can unlearn and learn in a different way. And I'm just going to add one comment. Probably 98% of the clients that I see, regardless of the presenting problem, the underlying issue that needs to be dealt with is either grief because of a loss or worry. And that's probably the bulk of what I focus on with people. How to develop coping skills to deal with the losses, which are part of life and which you can't avoid, little losses and big losses, and the worry that often accompanies loss. Any questions about worry? How many of you worry? You know, I can honestly say, and I think Michelle will back me up, I don't worry anymore. I'm concerned about many things, but I no longer allow myself to get into that zone. However, I must tell you, it took me years to develop that skill, but it is so freeing. It is unbelievably liberating. It can literally change your life. Certainly make you healthier.
That's beautiful. I love that. I love that.
So get a bunch of elastics and start snapping.
So what is sort of the opposite of worry, or what can help us move out of worry? And one of the things that can help us move out of worry is mindfulness. And I'm sure all of us have heard, about the importance of mindfulness. But what is mindfulness? So it's paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. And so if you sort of take the three legs to the stool, on purpose implies intention, paying attention implies attention, and in a particular way really speaks to the attitude that we have when we are being mindful. It's important to know that these are not discrete processes, that they are interconnected aspects of a single process that actually occur simultaneously. Right? And so here we are, intention, attention, and attitude. So I like to think of, I've been known to stress eat once or twice in my life. I'm sure all of us maybe have been there. And so when you're hungry, when you reach for that snack, that cookie, that whatever, are you really hungry or are you stress eating? And so in that moment, it's important to know, what is my intention? Why am I eating? Am I eating because I'm hungry? Or am I eating because I'm trying to soothe myself? Attention. What are the physical cues of hunger? Are those physical cues of hunger there or not? Right? So being aware of myself, right, can help me answer that question. And then attitude, am I in a good headspace? Am I in a bad headspace? Am I wanting to nourish myself or comfort myself? Right. So that could sort of be an example of sort of some of the ways that these things interact with respect to mindfulness. I also think about angry outbursts. When people snap or at one another, or they have an angry outburst. Anger is a secondary emotion, meaning that most people just don't get angry just to get angry. There's a reason behind the anger. And it's usually some sort of pain, whether it's physical or emotional, or fear, frustration, or hurt. And so if you're angry, again, it's being attentive. Well, if I'm angry, I'm not really angry, but am I fearful? Am I frustrated? Am I hurt? Right? So again, attending to the emotions that I'm actually experiencing that's fueling the anger. What's my intention? Is my intention to vent? Is my intention to hurt somebody because I've been hurt, so I want to hurt that person back? Or is it just to get somebody's attention? Maybe just by having an angry outburst, I'm trying to get somebody's attention. And then again, looking at my attitude. So those are just a couple of examples. Does anybody have any others that they would like to share? How they might practice mindfulness, or how mindfulness might benefit them?
And Michelle, we have a couple of really good comments in the chat. Lisa Brown-Bannock, did you want to open your mic, or would you like me to just address what you have? And Nancy, I know you don't mind having your mic open.
Hi, Nancy. Hi. No, I just was, I had commented in the chat that worrying is definitely an issue of mine. And I never thought that it actually shuts down creativity. And I think one of my, I'm really enjoying this presentation. And I guess my question would be what to do to bring myself back to that present moment in order to get myself out of that worry. I know you kind of touched on it a little bit. I don't know if you were going to be covering that now, but.
It's really about thought stopping. In other words, how do I stop that thought or the thinking? We can't control our thoughts. They just pop into our head, but we can learn to control our thinking. And worry is really thinking. It takes the form of thinking, and always thinking negatively, catastrophizing, not about what's happening right now, but what might happen somewhere down the road. So it's training yourself to recognize that you're headed down the worry path and stop the thought, stop the pattern of thinking, go back to home base and try to get into the concern. In other words, once you interrupt the worry loop and you get back to home base, now you can make a decision. Do I want to continue on the worry path? Do I want to just kind of disregard the whole thing and distract myself for a little bit? Or do I want to go down the concern path and identify what's really going on and what might be the solutions? Here's an interesting thing about worry. When we worry, we are always feeling powerless. And no animal in God's creation likes to feel powerless. So it's about empowering yourself in some way, which often involves, again, problem solving, seeing that there's always a solution. Worst case scenario, the solution is I have to learn how to accept this. Boy, we've all had an exercise in that this year. Don't like it, didn't ask for it, but I have to accept it. It's called surrender. How many of us have surrendered this year? Surrendered to what was and what we couldn't change.
Absolutely. And again, it's being in the present moment versus being in the future, which is not yet written, but we're trying to write in our head. So again, mindfulness versus worry. Mindfulness keeps us in the present moment. It keeps us in the here and now. So if I have certain symptoms of illness, I could either worry about what it is and get all panicked, or I can, say what's going to happen 6 months from now, or I can stay in the present moment and I can do something about it. I can call my doctor, make an appointment. I can go to that appointment. In other words, I can take the steps that I need to do to solve the problem rather than worry about something that hasn't come yet.
And may I take something from Dr. Judy, which I use all the time. When you've done all that, when you've done all the research, you've done everything that you can do, and I know you indicated that you're a planner, so you've done all the research, you've done all the planning. Now you have to turn the results out to the universe.
Yeah.
Which is surrender. That's surrender. Okay, I've done everything I can do, and now I'm going to let the universe take it.
Hi there, it's Lisa, baby Lisa Brown-Bannock. I think my mic is on now.
Yeah, we can hear you, Lisa.
Oh, fantastic, thank you. First of all, thank you for having this safe space to share. It's so important. I just came from a meeting at an organization where I'm a fellow veteran, and so in conjunction with that, I wanted to share how I commented on the chat room that to be in the present moment, sometimes you're in the midst of triggers or situations that are either frightening, threatening, or that are bringing you back to a time of feeling threatened or frightened. And that's why I made that quick comment that easier said than done, especially regarding triggers. So what kind of advice would you like to share in being in the moment when coping with triggers or threats?
Well, number one, for people that happens to frequently, I would suggest counseling. I mean, is PTSD an issue? When you get that feeling, is it possible to remember that feeling is an emotion? Is it possible to get into your head to kind of remind yourself that was then, this is now, and I'm not in immediate danger now? Again, I think bringing things back to the present moment where presumably the same things aren't happening can help you to redirect the feeling. Does that make any sense?
Sure, it certainly makes sense. I guess the second part of my mindfulness in the present moment is sometimes the threat is in the present moment. And I'm not talking about combat warfare. I'm talking about abuse situations. I'm talking about conflicting situations. And I appreciate what somebody was saying earlier, to open yourself up. I don't necessarily mean surrender, but to find in yourself the ability, the confidence to handle the situation. And that certainly takes practice, like any exercise.
Takes a lot of practice. Yep.
And that's what I meant by how. Maybe you could share some tips.
Michelle,
Dr. Judy, we're just about out. I can see we're just about out of time. We always seem to have this problem.
yes, we do. Shall we plan a follow-up?
Of course. This is the follow-up to the follow-up. We'll have to have another follow-up.
Yes. And Anna has posted some mindfulness race program for anyone that would like to worry less. And so that's, thank you, Anna.
And I've got some resources, and of course I'm happy to share this.
Perfect, thank you.
So I will do that. But let's just end on a positive note, right? And since we're all academics, right? So to steal ideas from one person is plagiarism, to steal from many is research. Right? If at first you don't succeed, try 2 more times so that your failure is statistically significant. And then he who laughs last thinks the slowest.
Yes, that would be me. That would be me. It is always such a pleasure to have both of you with us. And we will be sharing this information with everyone who has joined us. And again, thank you so much for addressing something that is so crucial always, but especially so right now. Thank you. What a pleasure it has been to share with both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Judy. We enjoy being with you.
Thank you, Dr. Judy.
And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Gigi, for joining us today. I'm so glad to be able to see and visit with both of you. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks.